This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 7, Intro to Language Technologies. In this lesson, we'll be talking about mechanical text. So the main example of a language mechanical text that we can talk about and the first development of modern technology to the invention of writing is the invention of the typewriter. So typewriters and typing were first developed in the late 1800s, and since then they have had a major influence on the way that we use represent language today, the way that we actually write language today. So, typewriter designers, what we'll be talking about a lot in this lesson is how the first keyboard layouts, which we actually use today, were designed, and how that was largely done in order to make conditions optimal for a typewriter design. Mostly this was to prevent the problem of type jams, which was common in typewriters at the time, although that's not really the case now. Nonetheless, we still use the same kind of keyboard layout. There were some later keyboards which aimed to use a different technique of laying out the arrangement of keys, namely to improve typing speed and make typing more ergonomic. But nonetheless, we've seen that the QWERTY keyboard is still very optimal, is still a very good keyboard. And we'll be talking in this lesson as to why that's the case. So the first patent for the typewriter was made by Charles Latham Scholes in 1868. And there had been some kind of early predecessors to the invention of the typewriter, but this version was the most significant because it laid the groundwork for the first major commercial typewriter. So this patent was purchased by Remington and Sons, and this was the company that was responsible for producing the first commercially available typewriter. And what's fairly significant about this, although typewriters are not used nearly as much today as they were then, the Remington company was very important for developing the QWERTY keyboard layout. And I'll talk about how the QWERTY keyboard layout was developed and why it's still used today. So to understand why the QWERTY keyboard was developed the way that it was, we have to understand the mechanics of how a typewriter actually works. So the way a typewriter works is it involves the action is entirely mechanical. It involves you pressing a key, and then by a system of levers that causes a stamp with the shape of a letter to hit a piece of paper. So I have a little video here showing that process in action. And what we see is that when the typer kind of hits the key, the type bar with the stamp on it moves very quickly up to hit the paper. So this is an example of how one particular letter could be typed, but a typewriter would have a set of these kinds of type bar mechanisms for every key in the entire alphabet, as well as other marks such as punctuation and things like that. So because we have this kind of mechanism and a very large number of them to accommodate all of the different letters, we have to lay out the type bars very close to each other. And this creates a potential issue, which is called a type jam. So a type jam is the name of what happens when two keys, which are next to each other, are pressed quickly or in rapid succession. And when this happens, it can be the case that the two type bars actually cross. And this can cause the two bars to get stuck, or it can even break them. And so because of that, jams are a very annoying issue for a typewriter, and they're a very difficult issue to fix. So Scholes, the inventor of who had patented the first version of the typewriter, worked to develop a keyboard that could minimize these kinds of type jams. So they wanted to arrange the keys in such a way that this issue would not be as significant. Now let's think, how can we actually minimize the frequency at which these type jams occur? Well, the first idea that we can think of is we want to make sure that letters which occur commonly together in a particular language, they should not have type bars which are close to each other. So for example, the letters T and H occur very frequently together in English, more so than any other letter combination. And so it would make very good sense to make sure that the type bar for T and H are not located next to each other. Otherwise, we would probably have a very high number of type jams. So we can do a statistical analysis of the English language to find out how frequently sequences of two letters, which we call bigrams, how frequently these bigrams occur. And we can make sure that all of these bigrams do not have type bars which are next to each other. So it was this kind of analysis that was really critical for the development of the QWERTY keyboard. So I'll go through how the actual process of how the QWERTY keyboard was developed. It unfolded in a series of stages. Now, it seems from the evidence that we have that QWERTY was actually developed through a process of trial and error. Now, the thing is, if we want to actually want to rearrange all the type bars in every possible order, this isn't something that's feasible. If you actually do the math for this, you would see that there would be 26 factorial possible keyboard layouts for the letters A through Z in the Latin alphabet. So that's a number that is just astronomically huge. So we can't just try every single ordering of the keyboard. We're going to have to make use a better heuristic analysis to actually get a good idea of what a good keyboard layout should be. It looks like as QWERTY was developed, that typists and typewriter inventors actually collaborated fairly closely with one another. And this was possible, keep in mind that because in the late 1800s, very few people could actually type and actually needed to type. So typing was a very small profession, and it's very likely that typists collaborated very closely with the inventors of the typewriter and probably had a major say in the way that a keyboard is laid out. So this might explain why the QWERTY keyboard was laid out the way it is and why it is actually fairly ergonomic and fairly optimal keyboard, as I'll be arguing a little bit later. So the first layout that we see with the QWERTY keyboard, which was developed in 1867, looks kind of like this. So you'll notice immediately that there are only 2 rows, whereas our current keyboard has many more rows than this. And we also see that the keyboard layout is actually completely alphabetic. We see the letters A through M on the bottom and N through Z, all in the exact order of the alphabet. So not an unintuitive order, but as we see, it's probably not something that would be optimal for preventing type jams. So notice that the letters S and T are right next to each other. And in English, S and T very commonly occur next to each other. So it might be better to actually keep the S and the T and the T and the H farther apart from each other. So the next arrangement we see kind of looks like this. We see this arrangement in 1868. So we see that these 2 rows were replaced with 4 rows, and this was for ergonomic reasons. Now it's easier to easily move your 2 hands over the keys. Yeah, so notice how wide the last keyboard was and how far you would have to move your hands. With this one, you can keep your hands relatively in place. So this was a big ergonomic improvement. We can also see that there are some slight movements. So we can see that the vowels were all moved to the top row. So we can see that there's some kind of reorganization here. And we can see that the consonants N through Z were flipped in direction. So this was a fairly simple change in the initial layout of QWERTY. So the next stage, we see that a few minor changes were made, and this had happened by 1873. Now, it's not so it's not exactly clear how Scholz came to this layout. There isn't really documentation as to how this happened. But as I mentioned earlier, this was probably something that had arisen out of collaboration with typists. So we can see that there were a few keys that were swapped around in a few places, and we can't really see the alphabetic ordering like we saw before, and we're starting to see a keyboard that looks more and more like the QWERTY system that we use today. And then finally, we get the resulting QWERTY keyboard, which had been developed in 1878, and it was used in the Remington Model 2 typewriters. So this is the official origin of the QWERTY keyboard layout. And interestingly, ever since 1878, we have been using the same keyboard layout, even for typewriters which wouldn't have as much of an issue of a type jam, or on computer keyboards, which don't have a type jam issue at all. So it's kind of interesting that this kind of keyboard layout has lasted as long as it did. So as I talked about, the QWERTY keyboard was developed in a way that ensured that there wouldn't be type jams, but not really developed as the main goal of being encouraging fast typing or ergonomic design. So because of that, there have been some alternative keyboard layouts that have been developed, the most famous of which is probably the Dvorak keyboard. So Dvorak was patented in 1936 by August Dvorak. It's named after the inventor. It was intended to be faster and more ergonomic. And the way it did this was by putting the most common letters on the home row of the keyboard. So that's the row in the center. So that means your fingers don't have to stretch as much when you're typing the most common keys. Some initial studies that Dvorak had run had shown that typists who used Dvorak were faster at typing than typers with QWERTY. But we kind of need to look a little closer to see whether or not Dvorak is actually a faster keyboard or more optimal keyboard than QWERTY. Well, what we can do is we can actually make a quantitative analysis of this. There was an interesting research project which had developed a way of measuring the quality or cost of a good keyboard. Underlyingly, what these researchers did was they assumed that what a good keyboard should have is that the common key combinations should be in positions which can be typed quickly. So that's a fairly reasonable assumption. Now what are these good positions? Well, first of which is that the fastest key pairs are things that alternate between the hands. So if we know that two letters are common in a particular language, like TH in English, then we should have T on the left side or H on the right side and H on the right side, and things kind of like that. And we also know that the index and middle finger are faster than the ring and pinky fingers. So that probably means we should put the more frequent and important letters in the center of the keyboard and the less frequent ones away. That would make a more optimal keyboard. So these researchers were named Light and Anderson. They are actually researchers from my alma mater, RIT. And they developed a system of making scores, a numerical score for these keyboards. So they developed a system of costs according to where these keys were laid out in relation to each other and the frequency of words in English. You end up getting a numeric result for the quality of the keyboard. QWERTY ended up getting 1542. That shows a fairly low cost as the keyboards go. And Dvorak got a slightly lower cost. So that means since it's a lower number, it means it is a slightly more optimal keyboard. Now, emphasis on slightly. These researchers found that there's actually very, very small differences in optimality between Dvorak and QWERTY. And also, if you want to try out many, many keyboard arrangements and find out how optimal can we get, the researchers weren't really able to exceed a score of 1428. So we can see that QWERTY is still a fairly optimal keyboard, despite it being developed primarily to avoid type jams. So this might explain why QWERTY has been so popular. It is in fact a fairly high quality keyboard at this point. So QWERTY is actually pretty efficient. That's kind of the key takeaway to make here. Now, as an aside for the invention of the typewriter, so we've been devoting a lot of time talking about the process of laying out a keyboard and how that affects us today. But it's also interesting to look how the invention of the typewriter affected society, in particular the creation of this new kind of profession, which was called a typewriter girl. So as typewriters were developed and as they became improved, the typing profession became more and more common. And interestingly, this profession became dominated by women. So in 1910, 80.6% of typists were women, and by 1930, this percentage had actually increased even more. This became a profession that became increasingly associated with gender norms. And this was an interesting development because the income that you could earn as a typist would actually allow women to live independently of each other and not have to live off of a husband's wage. However, it should be noted that even that although they could live independently off of this income, they were paid roughly half of a man's wage. So there was a very significant gender gap in this early point in time. And also, being a typist was mostly a dead-end job. It was not a job that you could really build a career on or develop. There was very little opportunities for advancement. It was because of the invention of the typewriter that caused many women who would move into the cities for work. So this would happen in the early 1900s. And there are some interesting authors who commented on this new trend of women who began to work in this kind of profession. So we can see that even in the invention, in the case of an invention as mundane as the typewriter, we can see some interesting social impacts. So to summarize what we've talked about in this module, we don't really know much about the exact development of QWERTY. Not a lot was actually recorded, but we know that type jams are a major issue and that this was probably the key aspect that motivated the development of the QWERTY keyboard. It was also likely the case that typists had a major say in the development of the QWERTY keyboard layout, which is why it ended up being as optimal and ergonomic as it is, as I had talked about talking about the cost scores of various keyboards. Now, there have been developments of keyboards aimed specifically at being ergonomic and not avoiding type jams, since type jams aren't really an issue anymore. But we've seen in this study that the Dvorak keyboard isn't really significantly better than QWERTY to warrant a complete replacement. And so this kind of explains why QWERTY is so popular as it is. And we've also shown how typing became an increasingly gendered profession and how an invention such as the typewriter can actually have a fairly significant social impact. So that's an interesting thing to consider as well.